Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Well Enough with Rick Hansen, Sharon Salzberg, and Kalia Kelmanson. We are so excited for tonight's conversation on a topic that is so important right now, keeping the mind well. During this evening's event, we will be utilizing the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question, please feel free to ask it here, and Kalia might just pull the question into the conversation. Please connect with other readers and guests using the chat function, which I see everyone's already using. We'd love to hear your thoughts, what you're reading, and how you're taking care of yourself during this difficult time. We just ask that everyone please stay respectful in the chat. Random House will be providing the link to each of our panelists' books that are currently for sale in the chat. The event will be posted on YouTube, and we will send that link to all guests in case you would like to rewatch or share with your friends and family. I am thrilled to introduce our moderator for this evening, Kalia Kelmanson. Kalia is the editorial director at Spirituality and Health. She has a curious spirit, is a voracious reader, and a lifelong student and teacher of mind-body wellness. She's joining us from her home on the island of Maui. And now, may I present Kalia Kelmanson and Well Enough.
Hi, everyone. This is Kalia. I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests. We're going to start with Rick Hansen. He's a psychologist, senior fellow of UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, and New York Times bestselling author. His books have been published in 29 languages with 900,000 copies in English alone, and include Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, Just One Thing, Mother Nurture, and his latest, which came out yesterday, Neurodharma, New Science, Ancient Wisdom, and 7 Practices of the Highest Happiness. He's lectured at NASA, Google, Oxford, and Harvard, and taught in meditation centers worldwide. An expert on positive neuroplasticity, his work has been featured on the BBC, CBS, NPR, and other major media. He began meditating in 1974 and is the founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom. Welcome, Rick. Also joining us is Sharon Salzberg, a meditation pioneer and industry leader, a world-renowned teacher and New York Times bestselling author. As one of the first to bring meditation and mindfulness into mainstream American culture over 45 years ago, her relatable, demystifying approach has inspired generations of meditation teachers and wellness influencers. Sharon is co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and the author of 11 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Real Happiness, now in its 2nd edition, her seminal work, Loving Kindness, and her newest book, Real Change, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World, coming this September. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Rick, I wanted to start today by asking you to share a simple technique to help everyone who has joined us shift gears and get our minds in a receptive state for today's conversation.
Well, first, I'd like to express my respect and gratitude for Sharon, who's been a friend and a teacher of mine, and also my appreciation for you, Kalia, doing this, and for Random House to set it up, and then, of course, for everyone who's participating. So much as we experience sort of physical separation from each other, I think it's especially important to kind of call on that profoundly human capacity to have a felt sense of others and a felt sense of imagining the beings over there, seen and unseen, known and unknown, the great and the small, to imagine them and hold them in our heart. So I hope we can all do that, and I'll be trying to do that too. The practice I'd like to offer is in that spirit. It's very brief. I call it the 3 breaths practice. It's grounded in some neuroscience that I can explain later if you like, but the fundamental evidence for it is in the laboratory of your own experience. So I'll describe it right now, and then we'll walk through it. In the first breath, we simply feel the chest as a whole. And let's do it together, step by step. So in the first breath, just feeling the chest as a whole. In the second breath, we feel the chest, especially around the area of the heart. And you may like to put a hand on your heart or touch your heart area. And in the second breath, we feel some sense of caring, some sense of compassion, kindness, respect, even love for one or more other beings. So in the second breath, breathing while caring. And in the third breath, calling to mind the sense of being around one or more beings who like you or care about you, who appreciate you, include you, perhaps cherish and love you. So in the third breath, breathing while feeling cared about. When we first start doing practices like this, naturally sometimes it's difficult, if not impossible, to sort of call up a felt sense of warm-heartedness flowing in and flowing out. But with practice, we develop trait warm-heartedness. And so one last time as a practice, I'll be quiet here, just 3 breaths in a row. Your chest as a whole, breathing while caring, breathing while feeling cared about. Here we go. I'll do it with you. Obviously, we can take longer with this practice, but it's wonderful to appreciate the power of just brief practices. As the Tibetan saying has it, if we take care of the minutes, the years will take care of themselves.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Rick. And so we've all been really profoundly impacted in the way we live, work, and connect with others during this pandemic. And it's been causing many difficult emotions to arise. There's been a lot of anxiety, fear, sadness, guilt, and depression. How have you both been navigating through this time?
Sharon?
All right. Well, I have found that my meditation practice, even going back to the very first things I ever learned, like being with the breath, have been tremendous sources of strength for me. And I think all the time about the stress dynamic, which is really a dynamic. There's the stressor, the incident, the collapse, whatever it is, and then it's the resource with which it's met. And for me, the greatest sense of resource comes, it's twofold actually. It's some sense of inner strength and it's a sense of connection with others, not feeling so alone. So, and oddly enough, meditation sort of serves both. You know, I think somehow it looks so solitary and excluding and you're there all alone, or maybe your cat's on your lap or something like that. You know, you're very, you look isolated, but it functions, the practice functions to create such a deep sense of connection to yourself and ultimately to others. And as well as that, there's just a kind of centering possibility, you know, just remembering, like, just take a breath. And you get so easily caught up in the stories and that others are telling about what is real and may not be so true. And the, you know, the frantic sense of, you know, anxiety, like, what if I don't get back to New York? And what if, you know, and then just to take a breath and to return to myself is, and that was like the very first meditation instruction I ever had was sit down and feel your breath. So I thought, wow, I've gone back like 47 years or something. And here it is, you know, it's still helping me.
Many things for myself. I mean, there's been a lot of problem solving, and I think finding our footing and seeing clearly as best we can, relying on experts of various genuine kinds, and taking skillful action. There's no replacement for that, including actions we might take politically, even out there in the world. You know, action binds anxiety. It's kind of a famous saying, and there's truth to that. Also, meanwhile, wow, I've had such a heavy heart. I'm sure, like so many, compassion just kind of blown open. And the other day, I read something that Adyashanti wrote, a teacher I respect a lot, and he said that his teacher had told him, I'm going to paraphrase slightly, that the world will break your heart, but make sure it breaks your heart wide open. And that quality of open-heartedness, I think, is such an important thing to sustain. And I've reflected as well on how helpless outrage, even if understandable and sort of aimed in that direction, can actually get in the way of compassion for those who are really, 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 really impacted by this, and self-compassion for ourselves. So that quality, as well as alongside it all, what else is true? There's something, I feel like I'm having ping pong whiplash of just horrible, amazing, awful, wonderful, boom, boom, boom. You know, what is also true? This time really draws us, I think, into reflecting on what is also true. You know, the things that are continuing to work, the people on the front lines who are stepping up for all of us, the people in ways that are not at all conspicuous. So the front lines of your own living room where you're schooling your child while trying to make a living at the same time, or restraining yourself from doing things you would normally really love to do for the sake of others so you don't harm them. I mean, we can take heart in what they're doing. We can take heart in the flowers that are still blooming, the water that is still flowing, you know, the breath that is still happening, and also take heart in our own kind of gritty fortitude. We're going to get through this one step at a time, one day at a time, one breath at a time. We will get to the other side, and then we'll look back and ask ourselves, you know, how did we meet this moment? And hopefully be glad in some reasonable ways about how we dealt with it. So these are some of the things that work for me.
Those are both really wonderful. Thank you. I think another thing that's been coming up is this fear of the unknown. And Sharon, you say that the unknown isn't so bad, that for you, you're more afraid of something else. Can you explain? Sharon, you're on mute. Sharon, you're muted.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you very much. I lost you altogether for a moment. I was saying one of the things that has stood me in good stead for many years, as well as especially maybe right now, is an ability to be more forgiving toward myself in feeling difficult emotions, which is actually part of mindfulness training. That you know, to be able to sit with anger, rage, fear, greed, jealousy, all of those things. And one of the first things we do is we try to pivot in terms of the meditative process. We try to pivot from like a fascination or obsession with the incident or what's bringing up the emotion to look at the emotion itself, to kind of come deep into its heart and understand its nature in a different way. And I've spent a lot of time doing that with fear, with my own fear. Just sitting there with it and trying to be with it and developing a different relationship to it. And one of the things I've seen in that process is that, unlike the world's pronouncement that we're afraid of the unknown, which of course is also true, I'm most afraid when I think I do know, and it's going to be really bad. And it's the stories I just keep telling myself that really get me going. And what I've seen, that was like a tremendous insight for me, because it doesn't only happen when I'm sitting, you know, on a cushion. It is very much my pattern. And I've seen that even in the midst of like the arc of anxiety, I can remind myself, you know what? You don't know. And for me, that means space. Something relaxes inside of me. And I just, in that space, there's possibility, there's options. There's still the unknown, you know, but it's not all like the dreadful narrative that I have been convincing myself of. Sometimes when I've really get into it, I say to myself, why are you rehearsing that? You know, you're just going over and over and over and over and over that particular dismal, dreadful scenario. And if it happens, it'll be hard enough to deal with then, but you don't have to deal with it all the way up till then. You know, and so that's really where that saying of mine comes from.
That's wonderful. Rick, so much of your work, including your new book, Neurodharma, explores how each of us has the ability to change our brain for the better. How is this possible?
Well, as Sharon well knows, there's a traditional saying that could be summarized as the mind takes its shape from what it repeatedly rests upon. So if we repeatedly rest our attention on resentment, well, we become more resentful over time. On the other hand, if we repeatedly rest our mind on, let's say, compassion for ourselves, or the capacity to accept the experiences we're having for whatever they are, well, we gradually develop traits of self-acceptance, traits of compassion. And the modern update from neuroscience is that the brain takes its shape from what the mind repeatedly rests upon. There's this wonderful saying from the work of the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb in the 1940s and 1950s, neurons that fire together, wire together. And that means that we have the power to, in any moment, be in relationship to the experiences we're having in a different kind of way. As we develop spacious, mindful awareness of what we're experiencing, accepting it, feeling the feelings, being with it as it is there, we literally are stimulating and therefore gradually strengthening circuitry, more or less, in our own brains that support mindfulness and related capacities of emotional self-regulation. And there's a tremendous amount of research at this point about how people who have, an imperfect, but, kind of more or less meditation practice, even people doing just a few minutes, or certainly doing an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program or something like it, can have literally measurable changes in neural structure and function. And like so many things, the more we practice it, the more we develop it. So there's tremendous evidence for that. And also, we have the opportunity to cultivate disengaging from and not ruminating about or reinforcing, as Sharon was saying, catastrophizing predictions or assumptions about the future. And also, we have the capacity for cultivation, in Sanskrit, bhavana, for again and again helping ourselves to recognize beneficial experiences, a moment of gratitude, a moment of grit, a moment of compassion, a moment of feeling connected, a moment of self-worth. And as we experience these, keep those neurons firing together, not out of clinging. Paradoxically, as we actually receive into ourselves these wholesome beneficial experiences, we become less hungry for them from the outside in. We become less driven by craving in the Buddha's second noble truth. We develop more of an internalized felt sense of enoughness already. And usually these are not big million-dollar moments, but the gradual accumulation, taking care of those minutes so the years will take care of themselves, breath by breath, synapse by synapse. As we actually take in the good, we build strengths inside. The worse our life is, the more the world is harming us, the more the world is letting us down, the more important it is to draw on this kind of self-reliance, of growing the good and developing ourselves in various ways. And we do that a lot for the sake of others. As we develop patience, and I'll speak personally, we become less of a jerk for the people around us. As we cultivate happiness, we become more resilient. Happiness, gratitude, a feeling of personal worth, that makes people stronger. It doesn't make us chumps, doesn't make us weaker. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about this. So, and we, deep down, just to finish, I guess, when we're pushed around by so many things outside us, it's especially important to claim this inalienable power we have in the inner temple that has to do with how we relate to the experiences we're having, how we nudge our attention one way or another, and how we help ourselves take in the good along the way. And no one can defeat us there. No one can stop us, but no one can do that work for us either. So we earn the fruits of our practice.
Thank you. And it makes me think, because I can say that I have cultivated a lot of those practices, in small doses along the way. But I think so many of us, I don't think I'm the only one who gets caught up in a downward spiral, this kind of negativity that just becomes all consuming. And so I wonder if you have any suggestions for when we find ourselves in that place where we're spiraling down, we're trying to get something positive to latch onto.
Well, I'm really interested in Sharon's take. I'll give a quick one myself. And I'm saying this both as a longtime therapist and then also as a practitioner and a neuropsychologically informed Buddhist. One is to ask ourselves, are we ruminating and spiraling as a defense against feeling something more fundamental? Are we caught up in anger, for example, as a defense against feelings of hurt or being let down, including by our leaders, or helplessness? And as we resource ourselves to be able to do this, to bear our own experience, it's really useful to open to it most fully. And that often can short circuit a ruminative spiral. That's one part. Another little hack that's very useful, that's supported by research, is to tune into the internal sensations of the body. And this is where we're starting to understand more scientifically why things that have been known for millennia actually really work. As you tune into your body, that decreases the verbal activity in these spirals. And it also is like a circuit breaker for the default mode network in the middle, toward the back and the sides. It's where we go when we're ruminating, right? Just tuning into your body just interrupts that process right there. And then I think also, just to quote my great teacher, Mr. Rogers, whose mother famously said to him, look for the helpers. That sense of tending and befriending, Shelley Taylor's work from UCLA about responding to stress, who are the helpers? And to feel connected with them and appreciate them and take heart in their example too is really good for us in terms of snapping us out of those negative loops.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that there's so many different approaches, and it's kind of like an experiment. Something that always intrigued me about the Buddhist teaching from the first time I heard about it was that suffering is not redemptive. The point is not to suffer. Suffering is inevitable, but it's not necessarily redemptive. And we probably all know people, sadly enough, who have had a hard time in life, and they're bitter and they're estranged and they're isolated. So the whole point of, you could say, mindfulness is the relationship to the suffering and the relationship to the joy. Because, as you know, Rick has taught me a lot about this, like our relationship to joy can be kind of weird too, and pretty distorted. And so it's how are we with the suffering, with the painful emotion and so on. And so that's one whole approach, is to be able to come closer to it. It's what I was describing about myself and fear. Come closer to the feeling, as Rick said, feel it in your body. Look into it, because it's so interesting, really. Right in the heart of that anger is so often helplessness. Right in the heart of that greed is so often loneliness. And so we learn just from that, and it's a different way of being. But there are also many practices that are, I call them, they're like about a stretch. I'm in this rut. I'm so used to looking at what's wrong with me, for example. How about if I give a little airtime to the good within me, just a little bit? Or, I'm so used to looking at those people as like whatever. What if I stretch and listen? Or I'm so consumed with what I don't have. What about a few moments of looking at what I do have? And it needs to be done in the right way, because it shouldn't be trying to disguise the pain, which is very genuine, or make believe it's not there. But it's understanding the limits of our normal way of paying attention and being willing to open in a different way. So that's like loving kindness practice or gratitude practice, things like that. And it's just like another approach.
Yeah.
Sharon, I wonder if I could just ask you, related to that, you're really known for a tender heart, for heartfeltness, compassion, and so forth, super sweetie. And I just wonder, what's been your own experience of the ways in which which some might say would make you weaker, more of a chump, more exploitable, and so forth, may well have actually made you stronger in various ways?
Yeah, well, it's totally made me stronger. If you go back to the Buddha's original teaching of loving kindness, he taught it as the antidote to fear. So here am I, like the fearful person, and and it is an antidote. You can feel it energetically because fear has us implode and withdraw and freeze. I was so happy when stress psychologists added freezing to fight or flight, because I thought, oh, that's me. Even happier when I heard about tend and befriend, but still freeze was like a good move on my part. And then there's loving kindness, which is opening, right? And spaciousness and coming closer to. So energetically, it's completely the opposite. And so it's been of enormous value to me personally. And, because I teach it so often, it's very interesting to me and funny to hear how many people are so cynical about it. And so like, oh, the heart, or sometimes, I'm in conversations about like a book cover or something, and someone in my world will say, no hearts, please, like something like that. And so it's such a prevalent notion that this compassion will make you tired, and loving kindness will make you weak and maybe stupid too. That's an add-on. Foolish, you lose all discernment, you just let people hurt you. And to counter that is difficult with words. I find it's best countered by one's own experience.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And it makes me wonder, Sharon, can you share some of your daily practices, and whether, given the scale of what we've all been facing, if they've changed at all?
I think they have changed a little bit. I mean, I have a whole bunch of kind of awareness practices that I do. And I have loving kindness practice, which is its own methodology. They're very connected, they're very related, but it is another method. And what I had come to was basically, I do sit every day. And when I sit, I mostly do a kind of awareness practice, often going way back to the breath. Or maybe a more open awareness. And I had come to a place where I do loving kindness practice whenever I'm waiting, and I've counted every mode of transportation as waiting. So airplanes, taxis, walking down the streets of New York. Now I'm doing none of that. I'm not getting on airplanes. I'm not getting in taxis. I'm not walking down the streets of New York. And I'm not, waiting in the same way of like waiting online at the bank or something like that. So I've found that I'm doing much more loving kindness practice in my formal practice. And it's also, the world is calling for it. I mean, it's just like, it's a world that so badly needs some love. And to whatever degree I can bring my energy to that, feels important.
Yeah. Thank you. How about you, Rick? What are your practices? I know you said you find yourself in a meditative state during those times of the day, but how have things shifted for you?
I would say formal practice. I've gotten really interested in kind of an expression of this principle of your mind takes its shape from what it rests upon. And I think in many ways, the fulcrum of Buddhist practice is to share from the second truth of craving to the third noble truth of less craving. And from a neuropsychological standpoint, the deep roots of craving for us as animals is a feeling of something missing, something wrong in terms of our core needs for safety, satisfaction, and connection. So we move into a state of, fear or anger or helplessness in terms of safety, move into a state of greed, grasping, addiction, drivenness for satisfaction, and we move into states of resentment or loneliness or vengeful aggrievedness in terms of us against them quarreling. So for me, it's actually really useful as a practice, genuinely, to look for opportunities to feel like there's an enoughness of safety in the present, to come into the present. There are times in the present, I've done a lot of wilderness things. There were moments where I wasn't safe at all. And I just dodged a bullet that could have been lethal, barely. But most of the time, there is an enoughness of safety so we can afford to feel all right now and drop into a sense of there's enough air to breathe, the heart is still beating, it's not perfect, there's pain, there's loss, but I'm basically okay. Similarly, with satisfaction. There can be an enoughness of gratitude, an enoughness of contentment. So we start to feel that. And then love, there can be an enoughness of connection. Yes, it would be nice to have more people like me. Yes, I'd love more 5-star reviews or whatever. But, you know, enough people love me, enough people like me, and there's love in my own heart. So the practice for me, which begins often, and this can be a fairly brief meditation, even 5 or 10 minutes long, particularly with some practice with it. Come into the body, come into the present, be with what's here. Things gradually settle some, establish stability of awareness, steadiness of mind, and then go, you know, can I let go of needless anxiety and rest increasingly in a sense of peacefulness? Can I let go of needless frustration or drivenness and rest in a sense of contentment? And can I let go of old feelings of inadequacy and nobody wants me, or, you know, irritated resentment toward others, and rest in a feeling of love? Peace, contentment, love. Technically, it relates to the 3-stage evolution of the brain, reptilian, mammalian, and primate. And as I humorously, dorkishly put it to myself, pet the lizard, feed the mouse, and hug the monkey. And then we rest in. We take peace, contentment, and love as the longing of our heart. And then we listen to the longings in our heart rather than pushing them away, and authentically look for opportunities to rest here with a falling away of craving. It's not enlightenment, it's not perfect, but it's, for me at least, it's a real refuge and a foundation for other kinds of practice.
Wonderful. Sharon, is there anything else that you would add for how to really ground ourselves in the present?
Well, you know, somebody sent me a link to an article, as people are often these days. And it was an article written by like a disaster survival specialist. I didn't realize there was such a specialization before, but apparently there is. And it was a great article, I thought, actually. It had, this is an aside also to Rick, that had a lot about gratitude practice. And which I know you're very much a practitioner of, you know, and a proponent of. And a lot about how people think gratitude, like they often think of loving kindness, as kind of stupid, and you know, it means you're just satisfied with crumbs that people will throw at you, and you get sort of complacent. But instead, they pointed to the strength of having that, because we need to face the difficulties with something, some sense of resource. But the part of the article that I was really aiming towards was, he had some line in there like, nobody's going to get an A+ in pandemic survival, you know, like, it's like, stop grading yourself. And it's not actually pass fail either. You know, we will get lost. We will get overwhelmed. We'll get exhausted, and we can learn how to start over. We can learn how to restore. We can learn how to have a new beginning right there. Which I feel like I learned almost the muscle memory of that in meditation, having my mind go to a billion places and learning how to start again. But there are many ways of learning it and reinforcing it. So for all the times, say at the end of a retreat, that somebody has said to me, how do I keep this level of concentration? Or how do I stay mindful all day long? And I usually say, you're not gonna. It's not gonna happen that way. But you can start over again with more gracefulness and better sense of humor and more kindness towards yourself, and so on.
I love it. Thank you. Rick, how is it useful to draw on the perennial wisdom of the ages for kind of the down and dirty crunch of this time that we're in right now?
That's such a, to me, really deep question. And, you know, I did this book that's really about the complete path in a lot of ways. You know, quoting the Buddha, good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end. And you know, it's, I'm sure, shameless here, but I'm so happy with the cover of my book. Total tip of the hat to Penguin Random House. They did a beautiful job. And it has that picture of the mountain on it. And for me, there's something so fundamental about the teachers inviting us to come join them. You know, honestly, Sharon is someone who, for me, has kind of invited me to join her in terms of compassion and loving kindness and other really perceptive, insightful ways of orienting to my mind. And I think that invitation to come join them, to cultivate those qualities in ourselves is really useful these days. And so, for example, here's a seemingly really esoteric teaching that's sort of hard to understand: emptiness. You know, that nothing arises on its own, nothing has a kind of brick-like solidity, everything is more like a cloud. Well, that deep teaching, as you know, Kalia, shunyata, the deep wisdom of that, emptiness, fullness, may seem really esoteric and intellectual. It's actually incredibly useful to appreciate the ways in which what has happened, all the things that are happening right now have the fundamental three characteristics of impermanence. They're changing, they're compounded, they're made of parts, and they arise dependently, and they arise and they pass away. So they are empty of absolute brick-like essence and substance. And to see them in that way, they're existent. This is not a spiritual bypass, but it's incredibly helpful, including observing the emptiness, quote unquote, of one's own reactions to things. So that, as Sharon was saying earlier, we don't hop on board them so much and get so identify with them. That's incredibly helpful, right? Or I'll finish on this one, the notion that we can love, in effect, unconditionally. I had a friend of mine who was a monk in Asia for 9 years. Knowing you would know, Sharon, he kind of came and went, I think maybe after your time. And I asked him if he ever met anyone who was enlightened. And he said, well, they have high standards there. It's not like you have a white light moment and then you have your own TV show the next week. They watch you. But yeah, I said, what were they like? He said, they were always the same. I went, what do you mean? He said, well, sometimes they were quiet, sometimes they would joke, but they were always the same in this way. If you were nice to them, they really loved you. If you were mean to them, they really loved you. Their love was not conditional. And I think that retention of a basic goodwill inside ourselves, not letting hatred poison us, not letting vengeful fantasies poison us, is offered to us by the great teachers. And these days, more than ever, it's really something important to cultivate in ourselves, if only for our own well-being.
Rick, could you hold up the book cover again for a second?
Sure. Well, that's an unsolicited request. Thank you.
No, it is an unsolicited request because the color is the color of the medicine Buddha in Tibetan Buddhism. So it's like it's considered the most healing color of all. And you held it up and I thought, I love that color. That's so beautiful.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's lovely. And it just makes me think about sort of, we can know these things intellectually, and then we have to bring them into, bring them to life by bringing them into practice. And before we move over to questions, I wonder if Sharon, you would be willing to share a short practice just to kind of seal this part of the conversation.
Sure, that would be wonderful. So why don't we again just sit comfortably, and you can close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease. Maybe we'll do just a few minutes of loving kindness practice, very briefly. So in that practice, rather than resting your attention on the feeling of the breath, you rest your attention on the silent repetition of certain phrases. And the phrases are things like, may you be safe, may you be happy. The idea is gift giving, it's offering, it's blessing. And traditionally, the first recipient is ourselves. So if you can see if you can just settle your energy into your body and begin making this gift to yourself. Don't try to force yourself to feel any special emotion. Just see if you can gather your attention completely behind one phrase at a time. May I be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. May I be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. People often say to me, who am I asking? And I say, you're not asking anybody. You're giving, you're offering. It's gift giving. And if you find your attention wandering or you fall asleep, truly don't worry about it. we say the most important moment is the next moment after you've been gone, because that's the moment, right? Where we practice letting go and we practice beginning again. That's the resilience moment. And see if you can call to mind a benefactor. That's someone who's helped you. Maybe they've helped you directly. They've helped pick you up when you've fallen down. Or maybe you've never met them. They've inspired you from afar. So if someone comes to mind, you can bring them here. Get an image of them, say their name to yourself. Get a feeling for their presence and offer the phrases of loving kindness to them. Even if the words don't seem really perfect, they're the vehicle for the heart's energy, so they're serving us. May you be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. Then we're going to have a gathering, friends, family, whoever comes to mind. And we'll offer the phrases of loving kindness to the group, to the collective. May you be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. And then all beings everywhere, all people, all creatures, all those in existence, near and far, known and unknown. May all beings be safe, be happy, be healthy, live with ease. When you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end the meditation.
Thank you for that. That was really, really lovely. So if you're both up for it, I'd like to take some questions now. bring in our audience. Here's one. When you're feeling low, what do you do to try to get up from that emotion or to shift from that emotion? We touched on it, but it feels like that low energy, that depressive energy feels a little bit different. So maybe Rick, you can share your thoughts with this one.
A lot to say. I know for myself, I try to feel it, first off. As someone who was numb from the neck down when he landed in young adulthood, I've really come to appreciate the importance of feeling our feelings. You know, it's the first and last and most fundamental practice of all. There's no alternative to it. And I think it's important to pay attention to the physical body and its health. Depressed mood is one of the first symptoms, one of the more fundamental or common symptoms of something off in the body, paying attention there. Activation is called behavioral activation. For those who are not profoundly severely depressed, so they literally can't get out of bed, in general, it does help to move. I make my bed when I'm depressed. I mean, I try to organize one little corner of my life, get one little flower somewhere. You know, as the proverb has it, better to light a candle, one candle, than curse the darkness. That reaching out to others, really important. Social support, extremely important, whether it's online or in your own imagination, where you call up the felt sense of being cared about. And maybe the last thing I'll just say about it, this is, drawn on some teachings from people who Mingyur Rinpoche, for example, who grappled with depression himself. Depression is a mind state like any other, and I'm not trying to minimize it, but as Pema Chodron puts it, you are the sky, everything else is the weather. So depression is like a cloud system that really comes in, but it's not the only thing. There is the field of awareness which contains it. There is the space between the depressive thoughts and sensations and feelings. There is what can feel like an unshakable, intact place inside us that is fundamentally serene and loving and content and wise and strong deep down inside, which is sort of the field or the container in which the storm clouds of depression, exist. So those are some things that I do.
And I'll just add that one of the most powerful ways I think of accessing that place within us that's intact is helping somebody else or being generous, and that just returns us there. However, fleetingly, it's like we might open our eyes and say, "Oh, look at that," and so it can be small. Sometimes we think about generosity, and it seems like it needs to be grandiose, But a very small thing, thanking somebody or reaching out to them in some way is enough to return us to that place.
Great, wonderful. We're getting a lot of questions about emotions. So another question has been, I have been feeling anxiety physically, so in the chest and the neck, that seems to come out of nowhere. These feelings do not seem to be obviously coming from my thoughts. Why and what do I do about them?
Maybe I'll just start. It's really, there's a term called signal anxiety. So very often what's happening is the below conscious processing, the body is tracking its state, and something could be a little wonky in our digestion or hormonal balance. And then what happens is all those signals start bubbling up, which then look for a reason outside us for a threat. So even though actually in the moment, the world is not threat level orange, we feel somehow like it must be, and then we start looking for a source. So I find one thing that's really quite helpful to do is to relate sometimes to anxiety. Definitely ask ourselves, is this telling me something? Is this a warning that there really is, a tiger in the bush is about to pounce? But very often there's no tiger there. It's a false alarm. It's like anxiety in a sense is like a car alarm just going off. It's noise. It's actually not signal. It's not informative. And so we can disidentify from it. We can step back from the anxiety. I think that's quite helpful. And then of course, draw in the sense of resources for the anxiety. We tend to feel anxious because there's a mismatch of perceived threat and perceived resources. often related on actual threats, actual resources. One way to deal with it, of course, is to bring down threats, but also scale up resources, to tune into that sense that you've got moxie, you're capable, you will get through this, you can endure this, if nothing else. And that's another way to help feel less anxious.
Great. I guess a follow-up question would be, how do you disengage? Is it sort of like recognizing that this is not a real threat and that telling yourself I am okay? That process of disengagement, maybe you could use some.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the Buddhist psychology as a system, which is its own system, one of the aspects of anxiety would be that it's a high energy state without enough tranquility to match it, to balance it out. So rather than consider it, like a personal weakness or a character flaw or something that indicates you need, a new therapist or whatever. I mean, all of that, not all of it, but the new therapist might be true, but that's not the time to try to figure that out, when you're feeling beset by anxiety. So it's dealt with as an energetic state. And so there are different approaches. One is see what creates space for you, because when a big energy is trying to move through a tight, cramped, enclosed space, it's going to be very jarring. Whereas if a big energy is moving through a big space, it can move. So that, people do everything from like go out and look at the sky, to offer loving kindness to all beings everywhere. And then, as Rick had mentioned before, move, let the energy move through your body rather than be all condensed and contracted. And then there are approaches that would say, okay, you've got a lot of energy. It's not channeled enough. It doesn't have enough tranquility to match it. So what's going to soothe you? There are ways of being with the breath that are very soothing. Or I've had teachers at different times say to me, feel your hands in water. Just put your hands in water and just like feel that. So it's some kind of sensual soothe that actually can create some balance. So it's just an interesting approach.
Oh, I like that. Those are great resources. I have a question here about what is possible in the middle of trauma, as with healthcare front lines, versus waiting for a post-trauma remedy.
I'm really interested in what Sharon will say about this from your background in developing parts of the world where people just on a regular basis deal with the kind of extreme conditions that here in America we're having a surge of, right? For myself, I think that what stands out in the middle of it all is, do as little harm as possible, to yourself and to others, and to write it out. But I'm wondering, Sharon, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, the greatest burden, I think, for a lot of people is the sense of isolation. Not, I mean, us being physically isolated, but when you are going through something and you feel like you're the only one. And that is, of course, exacerbated in these circumstances. But so it's the kind of thing where as soon as we feel we are a part of the human race, that as some people describe trauma, I think very accurately, as a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, then something shifts. And even in the height of it, people are so unkind to themselves often. Like I had a student once who was really feeling bad. She was so demoralized because she said, I'm not coping well, and I'm not handling things so well. It's really too much for me. And so I said, I want you to write out everything you've been through this year. And she chose not to do that. She chose to draw it out. And it was like, my cat died, my house burnt down, my mother got sick, I lost touch with my brother. And it was like, you've had a hell of a year, like this is hard stuff. And everything you're feeling, the nightmares and the disassociation, all of it seems to be kind of a normal thing to, you may not want to stay there, like live there, but seems like a normal response to a pretty crazy year. So look at what we are going through, and to remember that, I think, helps us a lot in getting through it. And then realizing you're not alone. Really, we're never alone. And that one way or another, we can find that sense of commonality.
That is really helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Just a small shift. This question is, neuroplasticity change takes practice, like everything else in life. But just how long does it take to shift the brain channels or to sort of wire new pathways?
Everybody wants to know, and of course, in our fast food nation, the minimum necessary transformation. There's no magic bullet. I like the Tibetan saying, gradual cultivation, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation. And I think that summarizes it a lot. There's this slow incremental process, and then kawoosh. There's kind of a breakthrough. And the breakthrough might be an opening into what was always already there inside us that we hadn't quite recognized. And neurologically, there can be changes that occur literally within less than a second that are fairly durable. And even structural changes you start to see on MRIs where the little tendrils of the neurons start reaching out toward each other and making new connections, even within 10 minutes or so. So the other question, of course, is how much are we in, how much of those old ways of being been reinforced? How hard is it to actually change? So it takes practice. But I like this saying from Milarepa. I've thought about it a lot lately. He was a great Tibetan teacher, describing his own life of practice, looking back on it. And you could apply this to specific changes we're trying to make in general. In the beginning, nothing came. In the middle, nothing stayed. In the end, nothing left. In other words, in the beginning, we may try to cultivate compassion or gratitude. We just don't feel it. In the middle, we're feeling it, but we haven't yet developed it as a trait. And then by the end, it's in us. It's unconditionally present in us as our nature, or something that is easy to call upon as the need has it. And so I think that really describes the process. And that's certainly what you see in imaging studies of the human nervous system and as well as in our own personal experience. And I find it really hopeful, right? That over time, our practices really will bear fruit.
Wonderful, thank you. Here's another one. How do you use fierce compassion when, or during difficult times when you're just really so tired and weary?
Well, I think you got to get some rest, really.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with rest. It feels like it's wrong. It feels like it's being lazy or something, but we need some rest. We need boundaries. That's realistic. We can't ultimately control what arises in our minds. We can't have that sort of demand like, I've grieved long enough, or I'll never be afraid again. Because when conditions come together for something to arise, it will arise. And so there's a certain amount of work, very important work, on how to relate to what has already arisen. But we can also affect those conditions. We can't control them, but we can affect them. So if you're watching the news 20 hours a day and you're exhausted, well, I would look at that, that would be a strong condition for me to be exhausted. And, so it's not blaming yourself for what you're feeling and understanding that we cannot ultimately control, but we look at conditionality and we see what we can affect. And we do need boundaries. And the idea of fierce compassion is that we can have a genuine, heartfelt, compassionate motivation, and our discernment or our best guess of the most skillful way to act in a certain situation, in a certain context, is saying no, or being fierce, or being intense. Like a lot of times people say, I don't want to develop more compassion because I could only then give that same person more money, or let them move back in, or let them continue to be hurtful. And it's not so, because we can have a compassionate motivation, truly so, and our best sense of how to act in a particular moment in time is like saying no, no way, or I'm going to fight you, I'm going to fight your agenda. And it doesn't mean the compassion's not genuine. So that's usually a liberating statement, for oneself, because it's so easy to feel, well, were I to be compassionate, I would be so meek and sweet and simplistic and, not very effective. And it's not that appealing.
Sounds like you're turning that fierce compassion towards yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, fierce self-compassion. Here's a good one. How do you deal with the heavy emotions of caring for and watching your sick person as they're failing in health?
For myself, during both my parents have passed away, and when I reflect on their last months and what I was dealing with in one particular case, I'll leave some details out. It was so bizarre and complicated and stressful and upsetting, and just as is implicit in what the person is saying, my heart was so heavy so much of the time. It was just like wave after wave. I felt like I was just awash in a stormy sea. And I started feeling like kelp, the seaweed, essentially, that the waves would pass through, but it would feel like, and I wouldn't resist them, because when I resisted them, it just got horrible for me and for other people. But if I just let them pass through and still retain some feeling of my own being, some ongoingness of being, attuned into my own body, and I'm still here. After a while, the wave would pass and I would still be here. That might sound kind of abstract, but I think it's a way to find what touches us that we connect with viscerally. That's an anchor, a refuge for how we want to be. And for me, that image really, really helped. I'm very interested in what you have to say to that, Sharon, including how people grapple with mourning, how we deal with loss. There's a lot of loss in this time, or empathic loss for the losses of others. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, something as a quote I use in my next book, the one that's coming out in September, which is something like, because there's a chapter on grief, grief changing to resilience. And I'm quoting somebody saying that grief is love without the usual place to land. You may be grieving a person, you may be grieving the person you once knew because they're not like that anymore. I may be grieving, and I think I am, the life I expected to be having right now. It's not there, it's not happening. And I think in listening to this question, my mind first went to, do we have expectations that are unrealistic of the person, of the situation? Because that's also what we're grieving, right? Is that they're not the way they once were. And so what's helped me is to think about that quote and come back to the love and realize that the love is still there. It just doesn't have the usual place to land, and to dwell more in that part of things. And I'm holding that to be true for all, mourning, and in general, it's inevitable. And I mean, what a ghastly time, and so much loss, and so much loss that's overlooked, by others, and so you especially don't want it forgotten. And reminding myself to come back to the love, which it's really an expression of.
Wonderful. Thank you both for sharing your perspective and your wisdom, and most of all, your love with all of us today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kalia, and thank you, Sharon, and thank our teachers. I'm thinking of the dedication in my book, for my teachers, and just the ways in which, we can really appreciate how we're here because, as Mr. Rogers put it, someone loved us into being, and all those other teachers and teachers, teachers and teachers of teachers of teachers, and all those people unknown, unsung, who still contributed, and we're riding their waves today. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations on your book. It's really great.
Yes,
you.
congratulations,
Yeah.
Rick.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's a wonderful book. Bye. Be well, everyone.